Traditions and Encounters, A Brief Global History by McGraw-Hill, Jerry H. Bentley, the 4th edition. Chapter 11, The Expansive Realm of Islam. Eyewitness. In 632 CE, the Prophet Muhammad visited his native city of Mecca from his home in exile at Medina, and in doing so, he set an example that devout Muslims have sought to emulate ever since. The Hajj, the holy pilgrimage to Mecca, draws Muslims by hundreds of thousands from all parts of the world to Saudi Arabia. Each year, Muslims travel to Mecca by land, sea, and air to make the pilgrimage and visit the holy sites of Islam. In centuries past, the numbers of pilgrims were smaller, but their observance of the Hajj was no less conscientious. By the 9th century, pilgrimage had become so popular that Muslim rulers went to some lengths to meet the needs of travelers passing through their lands. With the approach of the pilgrimage season, crowds gathered at major trading centers such as Baghdad, Damascus, and Cairo. There they lived in tent cities, surviving on food and water provided by government officials until they could join caravans bound for Mecca. Muslim rulers invested considerable sums in the maintenance of roads, wells, cisterns, and lodgings that accommodated pilgrims, as well as police forces that protected travelers on their journeys to Mecca and back. The Hajj was not only solemn observance, but also an occasion for joy and celebration. Muslim rulers and wealthy pilgrims often made lavish gifts to caravan companions and others they met en route to Mecca. During her famous Hajj of 976 to 977, for example, the Mesopotamian princess Jamila bint Nazir al-Dawla provided food and fresh green vegetables for her fellow pilgrims and furnished 500 camels for handicapped travelers. She also purchased freedom for 500 slaves and distributed 50,000 fine robes among the common people of Mecca. Most pilgrims did not have the resources to match Jamila's generosity, but for common travelers, the Hajj became a special occasion. Merchants and craftsmen arranged business deals with pilgrims from other lands. Students and scholars exchanged ideas during their weeks of traveling together. For all pilgrims participating in ritual activities lent new meanings and significance to their faith. The word Islam means submission, signifying obedience to the rule and will of Allah, the only deity recognized in the strictly monotheistic Islamic religion, and an individual who accepts the Islamic faith is a Muslim, meaning one who has submitted. Though it began as one man's expression of unqualified faith in Allah, Islam quickly attracted followers. During the 1st century of the new faith's existence, Islam far reached beyond its Arabian homeland, bringing Sassanid, Persia, and parts of the Byzantine Empire into its orbit. By the 8th century, the realm of Islam stood alongside the Byzantine Empire as a political and economic anchor of the post-classical world. Islam stood alongside the Byzantine Empire as a political and economic anchor of the post-classical world. Islamic society originally reflected the nomadic and mercantile Arabian society from which Islam rose. Yet over time, Muslims drew deep inspiration from other societies as well. After toppling the Sassanid dynasty, Muslim conquerors adopted Persian techniques of government and finance to administer their lands. Persian literature, science, and religious values also found a place in Islamic society. During the late centuries, Muslims drew inspiration from Greek and Indian traditions as well. While drawing influence from other societies, however, the Islamic faith thoroughly transformed the cultural traditions that it absorbed. The expansive realm of Islam eventually provided a political framework for trade and diplomacy over a vast portion of the Eastern Hemisphere. From West Africa to the islands of Southeast Asia, many lands of varied cultural backgrounds thus became part of a larger society often called Dar al-Islam, an Arabic term that means house of Islam, and that refers to land under Islamic rule. Here's the chronology. A prophet and his world. Islam arose in the Arabian Peninsula, and the new religion faithfully reflected the social and cultural conditions of its homeland. Desert covers most of the peninsula, and agriculture is possible only in the well-watered area of Yemen, in the south, and in a few other places, such as the city of Medina, where oases provide water. Yet human communities have occupied Arabia for millennia. Nomadic peoples, known as Bedouin, migrated through the deserts to find grass and water for their herds of sheep, goats, and camels. The Bedouin organized themselves in family and clan groups. Individuals and their immediate families depended heavily on the kinship networks for support in times of need. In an environment as harsh and unforgiving as the Arabian desert, cooperation with kin often made the difference between life and death. As a result, Bedouin peoples developed a strong sense of loyalty to their clans. Indeed, clan loyalty survived for centuries after the appearance of Islam. Arabia, also figured prominently in the long-distance trade networks of the post-classical era. Commodities arrived at ports on the Persian Gulf near modern Bahrain, the Arabian Sea near modern Aden, and the Red Sea near Mecca, and then traveled overland by camel caravan to Palmyra or Damascus, which offered access to Mediterranean basin. After the 3rd century CE, Arabia became an increasingly important link in long-distance trade networks. With the weakening of classical empires, trade routes across Central Asia became increasingly insecure. In response, merchants abandoned the overland routes in favor of sea lanes connecting with land routes in the Arabian Peninsula. In the process, their trade allowed Arabian cities to thrive. Muhammad and his message. Muhammad's early life, the Prophet Muhammad came into this world of nomadic Bedouin herders and merchants born about 570 CE into a reputable family of merchants in Mecca. Muhammad ibn Abdallah lost both of his parents as a young child. His grandfather and his uncle raised him and provided him with an education, but Muhammad's early life was difficult. As a young man, he worked for a woman named Khadija, a wealthy widow whom he married about the year 595. Through this marriage, he gained wealth and a position of some prominence in Meccan society. By age 30, Muhammad had established himself as a merchant. He made a comfortable life for himself in Arabian society, where peoples of different religious and cultural traditions regularly dealt with one another. Most Arabs recognized many gods, goddesses, demons, and nature spirits whose favor they sought through prayers and sacrifices. Large communities of Jewish merchants also worked throughout Arabia, and many Arabs had converted to Christianity by Muhammad's time. Although he was not deeply knowledgeable about Judaism or Christianity, Muhammad had a basic understanding of both faiths. He may have even traveled by caravan to Syria, where he would certainly have dealt with Jewish and Christian merchants. Muhammad's spiritual transformation. About 610 CE, as he approached age 40, Muhammad underwent a profound spiritual experience that transformed his life and left a deep mark on world history. His experience left him with the convictions that in all the world there was only one true deity, Allah, God, that he ruled the universe, that idolatry and the recognition of other gods amounted to wickedness, and that Allah would soon bring his judgment on the world. Muhammad experienced visions which he understood as messages or revelations from Allah, delivered through an archangel Gabriel, also recognized by Jews and Christians as a special messenger of God, instructing him to explain his faith to others. He did not set out to construct a new religion by combining elements of Arab, Jewish, and Christian beliefs. In light of his cultural context, however, it is not surprising that he shared numerous specific beliefs with Jews and Christians, and indeed Zoroastrians, whose views had profoundly influenced the development of both Judaism and Christianity. In any case, in accordance with instructions transmitted to him by Gabriel, Muhammad began to expound his faith to his family and to close friends. Gradually, others showed interest in his message, and by about 620 CE, a zealous and expanding minority of Mecca's citizenry had joined his circle. The Quran. Muhammad originally presented oral recitations of the revelations he received during his visions. As the Islamic community grew, his followers prepared written text of his teachings. During the early 650s, devout Muslims compiled these written versions of Muhammad's revelations and issued them as the Quran recitation, the holy book of Islam. A work magnificent poetry, the Quran communicates in powerful and moving terms of Muhammad's understanding of Allah and his relations to the world, and it serves as the definitive authority for Islamic religious doctrine and social organization. Apart from the Quran, several other sources have provided moral and religious guidance for the Islamic community. Most important, after the Quran itself, are traditions known as Hadith, which includes sayings attributed to Muhammad and accounts of his deeds regarded as less authoritative than the Quran and the Hadith, but still important as inspirations for Islamic thought, were early works describing social and legal customs, biographies of Muhammad, and pious commentaries on the Quran. Muhammad's migration to Medina. I will go ahead and that way you can see what the Muhammad or the Quran looks like. Muhammad's migration to Medina. Conflict at Mecca. The growing popularity of Muhammad's preaching brought him into conflict with the ruling elites at Mecca. Muhammad's insistence that Allah was the only divine power in the universe struck many polytheistic Arabs as offensive and dangerous, since it disparaged long recognized deities and spirits thought to wield influence over human affairs. The tensions also had a personal dimension. Mecca's ruling elites, who were also in the city's wealthiest merchants, took it as a personal affront when Muhammad denounced greed as moral wickedness that Allah would punish. Muhammad's attack on idolatry also represented an economic threat to those who owned and profited from the many shrines to deities that attracted merchants and pilgrims to Mecca. The best known of these shrines was a large black rock, long considered to be the dwelling of a powerful deity. Housed in a cube-shaped building known as the Kaaba, it drew worshippers from all over Arabia and brought considerable wealth to Mecca. As Muhammad relentlessly condemned the idolatry officially promoted as the Kaaba and other shrines to the ruling city, elites of Mecca began to persecute the Prophet and his followers. The Hijra. The pressure became so great that Muhammad and his followers were forced to migrate from Mecca. In 622 CE, they established themselves in Yathrib, a rivals trading city north of Mecca, which they renamed Medina. This city, meaning the city of the Prophet, known as the Hijra migration. Muhammad's move to Medina serves as the starting point of the official Islamic calendar. The Ummah. Once in Medina, Muhammad found himself at the head of a small but growing society in exile that needed guidance in practical as well as spiritual affairs. He organized his followers into a cohesive community called the Ummah, Community of the Faithful, and provided it with a comprehensive legal and social code. He led this community in daily prayers to Allah and in battle with enemies at Medina, Mecca, and other places. Remembering the difficult days of his own youth, he provided relief for widows, orphans, and the poor. He made almsgiving a prime moral virtue. The seal of prophets. Muhammad's understanding of his religious mission expanded during his years at Medina. He began to refer to himself as a prophet. Indeed, as the seal of the prophets, the final prophet, through whom Allah would reveal his message to humankind, Muhammad accepted the authority of earlier Jewish and Christian prophets, including Abraham, Moses, and Jesus, and he held the Hebrew Scripture and the Christian New Testament in high esteem. He also believed that Allah was one and the same as the Jews, Yahweh, and the Christians, God. Muhammad taught, however, that the message entrusted to him was a more complete revelation of Allah and his will than Jewish and Christian faiths had made available. Thus, while at Medina, Muhammad came to see himself conscientiously as the messenger who communicated Allah's wishes and his plan for the world to all humankind. The establishment of Islam in Arabia. Muhammad's return to Mecca. Throughout their sojourn at Medina, Muhammad and his followers planned ultimately to return to their home in Mecca. In 629 CE, they arranged with the authorities to participate in annual pilgrimage to the Kaaba. But they were not content with a short visit. In 630, they attacked Mecca and conquered the city. They forced the elites to adopt Muhammad's faith, and they imposed a government dedicated to Allah. They also destroyed the pagan shrines and replaced them with mosques, buildings that sought to instill a sense of sacredness and community, where Muslims gathered for prayers. Only the Kaaba escaped their efforts to cleanse Mecca of their pagan monuments. Muhammad and his followers denied the Kaaba was the home of a deity, but they preserved the black rock and its housing, cleansed of all the idols that had once been worshipped inside, because they maintained that it had originally been built by the prophet Abraham and his son Ishmael as a place for monotheistic worship. In 632, Muhammad himself led the first Islamic pilgrimage to the Kaaba, thus establishing the Hajj as an example for all devout Muslims. Building on the conquest of Mecca, Muhammad and his followers launched campaigns against other towns and the Budain clans, and by the time of the Prophet's death in 632, shortly after his Hajj, they had brought most of Arabia under their control. The 5 pillars of Islam. Muhammad's faith and his personal leadership decisively shaped the values and the development of the Islamic community. The foundation of the Islamic faith, as elaborated by Muhammad, consists of obligations known as the 5 pillars of Islam. Number 1, Muslims must acknowledge Allah as the only God and Muhammad as the Prophet. 2, they must pray to Allah daily while facing Mecca. 3, they must observe a fast during the daylight hours of the month of Ramadan. 4, they must contribute alms for the relief of the weak and the poor. 5, finally, those who are physically and financially able must undertake the Hajj and make at least one pilgrimage to Mecca. Although Islam has generated many schools and sects in the centuries since its appearance, the 5 pillars of Islam constitute a powerful framework that has bound the Ummah as a whole into a cohesive community of faith by faith. Jihad. Some Muslims, though by no means all, have taken jihad as an additional obligation for the faithful. The term jihad literally means struggle, and Muslims have understood its imperatives in various ways. In one sense, jihad imposes obligations on Muslims by requiring them to combat vice and evil, both within the self and externally. In another sense, jihad calls on Muslims to struggle against unbelief by spreading the word of Islam and seeking converts to the faith. In some circumstances, jihad also obliges Muslims to take up the sword and wage war against unbelievers who threaten Islam. Islamic law of the Shariah. Beyond the general obligations prescribed by the 5 pillars, Islamic holy law, known as the Shariah, emerged during the centuries after Muhammad and offered detailed guidance on proper behavior in almost every aspect of life. Inspired by the Quran and elaborated by jurists and legal scholars, the Shariah offered precise guidance on matters as diverse as marriage and family, life, inheritance, slavery, business relationships, political authority, and crime. Through the Shariah, Islam became more than a religious doctrine. It developed into a way of life. I'll go ahead and do sources from the past, should you wish to read this at your leisure. The expansion of Islam. After Muhammad's death, the Islamic community might well have unraveled and disappeared. Muhammad had made no provision for a successor, and there was a serious division within the Ummah concerning the selection of a new leader. Many of the towns and Budain clans that had recently accepted Islam took the opportunity of Muhammad's death to renounce their faith, reassert their independence, and break free from the Mecca's control. Within a short time, however, the Islamic community had embarked on a stunningly successful round of military expansion that extended its political and cultural influence far beyond the boundaries of Arabia. Those conquests laid the foundation for rapid growth of the Islamic society. This is thinking about traditions. The early caliphs and I'm so sorry, my hand's shaking today. The Umayyad dynasty, the Caliph. Because Muhammad was the seal of the prophets, it was inconceivable that another prophet should succeed him. Shortly after Muhammad's death, his advisors selected Abu Bakr, a genial man who was one of the prophet's closest friends and most devoted disciples, to serve as Caliph deputy. Thus, Abu Bakr and later caliphs led the Ummah not as prophets, but as substitutes for Muhammad. Abu Bakr became head of the state for the Islamic community, as well as chief judge, religious leader, and military commander, echoing the kind of marriage between religious and secular authority exercised by the Byzantine rulers in Chapter 10. Under the new caliph's leadership, the Ummah went on the offensive against people who had renounced Islam after Muhammad's death, and within a year it had compelled them to recognize the faith of Islam and rule the caliph. Go ahead and look at the map on this so that you may see this. The expansion of Islam. Indeed, during the century after Muhammad's death, Islamic armies carried their religion and authority throughout Arabia into the Byzantine and Sassanid territories and beyond. Although much less powerful than either the Byzantine Empire or the Sassanid Empire, Muslim armies fought with particular effectiveness because their leaders had unified tribal groups into, that just went blank. Tribal groups into powerful state under the banner of Islam. Moreover, they attacked at a moment when the larger empires were preoccupied with internal difficulties. Between 633 and 637 CE, Muslim forces seized Byzantine Syria and Palestine and took most of Mesopotamia from Sassanids. During the 640s, they conquered the Byzantine, Egypt, and North Africa. In 651, they toppled the Sassanid dynasty and incorporated Persia into their expanding empire. In 711, they conquered the Hindu kingdom of Sindh in northwestern India. Between 711 and 718, they extended their authority to northwest Africa and crossed the Strait of Gibraltar, conquering most of the Iberian Peninsula and threatening the Frankish kingdom in Gaul. By the mid-8th century, an immense Islamic empire ruled lands from India and the Central Asian steppe lands in the east to northwest Africa and Iberia in the west. During the rapid expansion of the empire's rulers encountered problems of governance and administration. One problem had to do with the selection of caliphs during the early decades after Muhammad's death. Leaders of the most powerful Arab clans appointed the first 4 caliphs. Political ambitions, personal differences, and clan loyalties, however, soon led to the rise of factions and parties within the Islamic community. The Shia disagreements over succession led to the emergence of the Shia Sect, the most important and enduring of all the alternatives to the faith observed by the majority of Muslims, known as Sunni Islam. The Shia sect originated as a party supporting the appointment of Ali, a cousin and son-in-law of Muhammad, and his descendants as caliphs. Ali did serve briefly as the 4th caliph, 656 to 661 CE, but his enemies assassinated him, killed many of his relatives, and imposed their own candidate as caliph. Partisans of Ali then organized the Shia party and furiously struggled to return the caliphate into the line of Ali. Although persecuted, the Shia survived and strengthened its identity by adopting doctrines and rituals distinct from those of the Sunnis, traditionalists who accepted the legitimacy of early caliphs. Shia partisans, for example, observed holy days in honor of their leaders and martyrs to their cause, and they taught that descendants of Ali were infallible, sinless, and divinely appointed to the the Islamic community. The Umayyad Dynasty. After the assassination of Ali, the establishment of the Umayyad Dynasty, 661 to 750 CE, temporarily solved the problem of succession. The Umayyads, ranked among the most prominent of the Meccan merchant clans, and their reputation and network of alliances helped them bring stability to the Islamic community. Despite their association with Mecca, the Umayyads established their capital at Damascus, a thriving commercial city in Syria whose central location enabled them to maintain better communication with the vast and still expanding Islamic empire. Policy toward, hopefully you can read that, so you can pause this should you want to read that. Policy toward conquered peoples. Although the Umayyad dynasty solved the problem of succession, their tightly centralized rule and the favor they showed their fellow Arabs generated an administrative problem. The Umayyads ruled the Dar al-Islam as conquerors, and their policies favored the Arab military aristocracy by distributing both lands and positions of power among this privileged class. Such policies caused severe discontent among the scores of ethnic and religious groups encompassed within the Umayyad Empire. In addition, although the Arabs mostly allowed conquered peoples to observe their own religions, they levied a special head tax called a jizya on those who did not convert to Islam. Moreover, even those who converted did not enjoy access to wealth and positions of authority, which the Umayyads reserved almost exclusively for members of the Arab military aristocracy. Umayyad declined. Beginning in the early 8th century, the Umayyad caliphs became alienated even from other Arabs as they devoted themselves increasingly to luxurious living rather than moral leadership of the Ummah. By mid-century, the Umayyad caliphs faced not only the continued resistance of the Shia faction, but also the discontent of conquered peoples throughout their empire and even the disillusionment of Muslim Arab military leaders. The Abasid Dynasty. Abu al-Abbas rebellion in Persia brought the Umayyad dynasty to an end. The chief leader of the rebellion was Abu al-Abbas, a descendant of Muhammad's uncle. Although he was a Sunni Arab, Abu al-Abbas allied readily with Shias and with non-Arab Muslims during the 740s. Abu al-Abbas's party seized control of Persia and Mesopotamia. In 750, his army shattered Umayyad forces in a great battle. Afterward, Abu al-Abbas invited the remaining members of the Umayyad clan to a banquet under the pretext of reconciliation their differences. Instead, during the festivities, his troops slaughtered the Umayyads and annihilated the clan. The Abu al-Abbas then founded the Abbasid Dynasty, which was the principal source of authority in the Dar al-Islam until the Mongols toppled it in 1258 CE. The Abbasid Dynasty. The Abbasid Dynasty differed considerably from the Umayyad. For one thing, Abbasid rulers did not show special favor to the Arab military aristocracy. Arabs continued to play a large role in government, but Persian, Egyptians, Mesopotamians, and others also rose to positions of wealth and power. The Abasid Dynasty differed from the Umayyad also in that it was not a conquering dynasty. The Abbasids did clash intermittently with the Byzantine Empire and nomadic peoples from Central Asia. And in 751, they defeated a Chinese army at the Talas River near Samarkand. The Battle of Talas River was exceptionally important. It ended the expansion of China's Tang dynasty into Central Asia, discussed in Chapter 12, and it opened the door for the spread of Islam among Turkish people. Overall, however, Abbasids did not expand their empire by conquest. The Dar al-Islam as a whole continued to grow during the Abbasid era, but that was a result of largely autonomous Islamic forces rather than the policies of caliphs. During the 9th and early 10th centuries, for example, largely autonomous Islamic forces from distant Tunisia mounted naval expeditions throughout the Mediterranean, seizing various island territories, as well as the territories in southern Italy and southern France. Meanwhile, Muslim merchants introduced Islam to southern India and the sub-Saharan Africa, discussed in chapters 13 and 15. Abasid Administration. Instead of conquering new lands, the Abbasids largely contented themselves with administering the empire they inherited, a considerable challenge given the empire's diversity of linguistic, ethnic, and cultural groups. In designing their administration, the Abbasids relied heavily on Persian techniques of statecraft, whereby rulers devised policies, built capital cities to oversee affairs, and organized their territories through regional governors and bureaucracies. Baghdad. Central authority came from the court at the magnificent new city of Baghdad, capital of modern Iraq. By building this new center of government to replace the Umayyad capital at Damascus, the Abbasids associated themselves with the cosmopolitan environment of Mesopotamia. Baghdad was a round city protected by 3 round walls. At the heart of the city was the caliph's green-domed palace, from which instructions flowed to the distant reaches of the Abbasid realm. In the provinces, governors represented the caliph and implemented his political and financial policies. Learned officials known as ulama, people with religious knowledge, and qadis, judges, set moral standards in local communities and resolved disputes. Ulama and qadis were not priests. Islam does not recognize priests, but they had formal education and emphasized study of the Quran and the Shariah. Ulami were pious scholars who sought to develop public policy in accordance with the Quran and the Shariah. Qadis heard cases at law and rendered decisions based on the Quran and the Shariah. Because of their moral authority, ulama and qadis became extremely influential officials who helped to ensure widespread observance of Islamic values. The Abbasid caliphs also kept a standing army, maintained the network of roads they inherited from the Sassanids, and established bureaucratic ministries in charge of taxation, finance, coinage, and postal services. Harun al-Rashid. The high point of the Abbasid Dynasty came from during the reign of the Caliph Harun al-Rashid, 786 to 809 CE. By the late 8th century, Abbasid authority had lost some of its force in provinces distant from Baghdad, but it remained strong enough to bring reliable tax revenues from most parts of the empire. Flush with wealth, Baghdad became a center of banking, commerce, crafts, and industrial production, a metropolis with a population of several 100,000 people. According to stories from his time, Harun al-Rashid provided liberal support for artists and writers, bestowed lavish and luxurious gifts on his favorites, and distributed money to the poor and the common classes by tossing coins into the streets of Baghdad. Once he sent an elephant and a collection of rich presents as a gift to his contemporary Charlemagne, who ruled the Carolingian, I can't pronounce that, ruled the Carolingian Empire of Western Europe. I am so sorry about that. Abbasid Decline. In the early 9th century, however, the Abbasid Empire entered a period of decline and disputes over succession seriously damaged its authority. Provincial governors took advantage of disorder in the ruling house by acting independently of the caliphs and building up local bases of power. Meanwhile, popular uprisings and peasant rebellions further weakened the empire. As a result of these difficulties, the Abbasid caliphs became more figureheads long before the Mongols extinguished the dynasty in 1258. In 945, members of a Persian noble family seized control of Baghdad and established their clan as the power behind the Abbasid throne. Later, imperial authorities in Baghdad fell under the control of the Seljuk Turks, a nomadic people from Central Asia who also invaded the Byzantine Empire. In response to the rebellion mounted by peasants and provincial governors, authorities in Baghdad allied in the Seljuks, who began to enter the Abbasid realm and convert to Islam in about the mid-10th century. By the mid-11th century, the Seljuks effectively controlled the Abbasid Empire during the 1050s. They took possession of Baghdad during the following decades. They extended their authority to Syria, Palestine, and Anatolia. They retained Abbasid caliphs as normal sovereigns, but for 2 centuries until the arrival of the Mongols, the Seljuk Sultan ruler was the true source of power in the Abbasid Empire. The economy and society of the early Islamic world. In the Dar al-Islam, as in other agricultural societies, peasants tilled the land while manufacturers and merchants supported a thriving urban economy. Here, as in other lands, the creation of large empires had dramatic economic implications. The Umayyad and the Abbasid empires created a zone of trade, exchange, and communication stretching from India to Iberia. Commerce throughout the zone served as a vigorous economic stimulus for both the countryside and the cities of the early Islamic world. New crops, agricultural experimentation, and urban growth. The spread of food and industrial crops as soldiers, administrators, diplomats, and merchants traveled throughout the Dar al-Islam. They encountered plants, animals, and agricultural techniques peculiar to the empire's various regions. They often introduced particularly useful crops to new regions. The most important of the transplants traveled west from India and included staple crops such as sugarcane, rice, and new varieties of sorghum and wheat. Vegetables such as spinach, artichokes, fruits and such as oranges, bananas, coconuts, and mangoes, and industrial crops such as cotton, indigo, and henna. Here is the Islamic map. If it will zone in properly. Sometimes it doesn't. Sorry about that. Effects of the new crops. The introduction of these crops into Western regions of the Islamic world had wide-ranging effects. New food crops led to a richer and more varied diet. They also increased quantities of food available because they enabled cultivators to extend growing season. Since most of the transplanted crops grew well in high heat, cultivators in Southwest Asia and other hot zones could plant an additional crop in the summer months instead of leaving their fields fallow. The result was a dramatic increase in food supplies. Agricultural experimentation. Travel and communication in the Dar al-Islam also encouraged experimentation with agricultural methods. Cultivators paid close attention to methods of irrigation, fertilization, crop rotation, and the like, and they outlined their findings in hundreds of agricultural manuals. The combined effect of new crops and improved techniques was a far more productive agricultural economy, which in turn supported vigorous economic growth throughout the Dar al-Islam. Here is the agriculture. Should you wish to pause and read that? Urban growth. Increased agricultural production and contributed to the rapid growth of cities in all parts of the Islamic world, from India to Spain. All these cities, including, for example, Delhi, Merv, Isfahan, Damascus, Cairo, Cordoba, and Tangier, had flourishing markets supporting thousands of artisans, craftsmen, and merchants. Most of them were also important centers of industrial production, particularly of textiles, pottery, glassware, leather, iron, and steel. One new industry appeared in Islamic cities during the Abbasid era: paper manufacture. When Arab forces defeated a Chinese army at the Battle of the Talas River in 751, they took prisoners skilled in paper production and learned the techniques from them. Paper soon became popular throughout the Islamic world. Paper facilitated the keeping of administrative and commercial records, and it made possible the dissemination of books and books and treaties in larger quantities than ever before. By the 10th century, mills produced paper in Persia, Mesopotamia, Arabia, Egypt, and Spain, and the industry soon spread to Western Europe. The formation of the hemispheric trading zone. From its earliest days, Islamic societies, Islamic society drew much of its prosperity from commerce. Muhammad himself was a merchant, and he held merchants in high esteem. By the time there we go. That's clear. I'm so sorry about that. Muhammad himself as a merchant, and he held merchants in high esteem. By the time the Abbasid Caliphate, elaborate trade networks linked all regions of the Islamic world and joined it to a larger hemispheric economy. Overland Trade. When they overran the Sassanid Empire, Muslim conquerors brought the prosperous trading cities of Central Asia under the control of expanding Dar al-Islam. Muslim merchants were then able to take advantage of the extensive road networks originally built during the classical era by imperial authorities in India, Persia, and the Mediterranean basin. To be sure, Umayyad and Abbasid rulers maintained the roads for military and administrative purposes, but those same roads also made excellent highways for merchants as well as missionaries and pilgrims. Camels and caravans. Overland trade traveled mostly by camel caravan. Although they were uncooperative beasts, camels endure the rigors of desert travel much better than horses or donkeys. Moreover, when fitted with a well-designed saddle, camels can carry heavy loads. During the early centuries CE, the manufacture of camel saddles spread throughout Arabia, North Africa, Southwest Asia, and Central Asia, and camels became the favored beasts of burden in deserts and other dry regions. As camel transportation became more common, the major cities of the Islamic world and Central Asia I'll pause it real quick. You can see that. Maintained caravansaries, inns, offering lodging for caravan merchants as well as food, water, and care for their animals. Maritime trade. Meanwhile, innovations in nautical technology contributed to a steadily increasing volume of maritime trade in the Red Sea, Persian Gulf, Arabian Sea, and Indian Ocean. Arab and Persian mariners borrowed the compass from its Chinese inventors and used it to guide them on the high seas. From Southeast Asian and Indian mariners, they borrowed a lateen sail, a triangular sail that increased a ship's maneuverability. From the Hellenistic Mediterranean, they borrowed the astrolabe, an instrument that enabled them to calculate latitude. Thus equipped, Arab and Persian mariners ventured throughout the Indian Ocean basin. Banking also stimulated the commercial economy of the Islamic world. Banks had offered since classical antiquity, but Islamic banks of the Abbasid period conducted business on a much larger scale than their predecessors. They not only lent money to entrepreneurs, but also served as brokers for investments and exchanged different currencies. They established multiple branches that honored letters of credit known as sak, drawn on the parent bank. Thus, merchants could settle accounts with distant business partners without having to deal in cash. The organization of trade. Trade benefited also from refined techniques of business organization. Usually, Islamic businessmen preferred not to embark on solo ventures, since an individual could face financial ruin if an entire cargo of commodities fell prey to pirates or went down with a ship that sank in a storm. Instead, like their counterparts in other post-classical societies, Abbasid entrepreneurs often pooled their resources in a variety of group investments designed to distribute individual risks. As a result of improved transportation, expanded banking services, and refined techniques of business organization, long-distance trade surged in the early Islamic world. Muslim merchants dealt in silk, ceramics from China, spices and aromatics from India and Southeast Asia, and jewelry and fine textiles from the Byzantine Empire. Merchants also ventured beyond settled societies in China, India, and the Mediterranean basin to distant lands that previously had not engaged systematically in long-distance trade. They crossed the Sahara Desert by camel caravan to trade salt, steel, copper, and glass for gold, and slaves from the kingdoms of West Africa. They visited the coastal regions of East Africa, where they obtained slaves and exotic local commodities such as animal skins. They engaged in trade with Russia and Scandinavia by way of Dnieper and Volga rivers, and obtained commodities such as animal skins, fur, honey, amber, and slaves, as well as bulk goods such as timber and livestock. The vigorous economy of the Abbasid Empire thus helped us to establish networks of communication and exchange throughout much of the Eastern Hemisphere. Al-Andalus. The prosperity of Islamic Spain, known as Al-Andalus, illustrates the far-reaching efforts of long-distance trading of the Abbasid era. Most of the Iberian Peninsula had fallen into the hands of the Muslim. Go ahead and scroll on that so you can see that. Muslim Berber conquerors from North Africa during the early 8th century. As allies of the Umayyads, the governors of Al-Andalus refused to recognize the Abasid Dynasty, and beginning in the 10th century, they styled themselves caliphs in their own right rather than governors subject to Abbasid authority. Despite political and diplomatic tensions, the Al-Andalus participated actively in the commercial life of the larger Islamic world, which enabled merchants and manufacturers in Al-Andalus to conduct thriving businesses, in cities such as Cordoba, Toledo, and Seville. The changing status of women. A patriarchal society had emerged in Arabia long before Muhammad's time, but Arab women enjoyed rights not accorded to women in many other lands. They could legally inherit property, divorce husbands on their own initiative, and engage in business ventures. Khadijah, the first of Muhammad's 4 wives, managed a successful commercial business. The Quran and women. In some respects, the Quran enhanced the security of women in Arabian society. It outlawed female infanticide, and it provided that dowries go directly to brides rather than to their husbands and male guardians. It portrayed women not as the property of their menfolk, but as honorable individuals, equal to men before Allah, with their own rights and needs. Muhammad's own kindness and generosity toward his wives also served as an example that may have improved the lives of Muslim women. For the most part, however, the Quran and later the Shariah as well reinforced male dominance. The Quran and Islamic holy law recognized descent through the male line, and to guarantee proper inheritance, they placed a high premium on genealogical purity to ensure the legitimacy of heirs. They subjected the social and sexual lives of women to strict control of male guardians. The Quran and the Shariah also permitted men to take up to 4 wives, whereas women could only have 1 husband. The Quran and the Shariah thus provided a religious and legal foundation for a decisively patriarchal society. Veiling of women. When Islam expanded into the Byzantine and Sassanid empires, it encountered strong patriarchal traditions, and Muslims readily adopted long-standing customs such as the veiling of women. Social and family pressures had induced upper-class urban women to veil themselves in Mesopotamia as early as the 13th century BCE, and long before Muhammad, the practice of veiling had spread to Persia and the eastern Mediterranean. When Muslim Arabs conquered these lands, they adopted the practice, a conspicuous symbol of male authority, thus found a prominent place in the early Islamic community. Although the Quran served as the preeminent source of authority in the Islamic world, over the centuries, jurists and legal scholars interpreted the Quran in ways that progressively limited the rights of women. To a large extent, the increased emphasis on male authority in Islamic law reflected the influence of the strongly hierarchical and patriarchal societies of Mesopotamia, Persia, and eastern Mediterranean lands. as Islam developed from a local faith to a large-scale, complex society. Islamic values and cultural exchanges. Since the 7th century CE, the Quran has served as the cornerstone of Islamic society. Arising from a rich tradition of the Bedouin poetry and song, the Quran established Arabic as a flexible and powerful medium of communication. When carrying their faith to new lands during the era of the Islamic expansion, Muslim missionaries spread the message of Allah and provided instruction in the Quran's teachings. Although they also permitted continued observance of the pre-Islamic traditions, Muslim intellectuals drew freely from the long-established cultural traditions of Persia, India, and Greece, which they became acquainted with during the Umayyad and Abbasid eras. The formation of an Islamic cultural tradition. Muslim theologians and jurists looked to the Quran and other sources of Islamic doctrine in their efforts to formulate moral guidelines appropriate for their society. The body of civil and criminal law embodied in the Shariah provided a measure of cultural unity for the vastly different lands of the Islamic world. Islamic law did not by any means erase differences, but it established a common cultural foundation that facilitated dealings between peoples of various Islamic lands and that lent substance to the concept of the Dawah al-Islam. Promotion for Islamic values. On a more popular level, ulama, qadis, and missionaries helped to spread Islamic values throughout Dawah al-Islam. Ulama and qadis held positions at all Islamic courts by resolving disputes according to Islamic law and ordering public observance of Islamic social and moral standards. They helped to bring the values of the Quran and the Shariah into the lives of peoples living far from the birthplace of Islam. Here's a close-up of the reverberations. Sometimes it focuses really good, guys. There it goes. Sometimes my phone just does not want to focus at all. I'm so sorry about that. See if you can. There we go. Formal educational institutions also helped promote Islamic values. For example, many mosques maintained schools that provided an elementary education and religious instruction. By the 10th century, institutions of higher education known as madrasas had begun to appear, and by the 12th century, they had become established in the major cities of the Islamic world. Muslim rulers often supported the madrasas in the interest of recruiting literate and learned students for administrative positions. Sufis, oh gosh, it goes blurry and then it goes, there we go. Among the most effective Islamic missionaries were mystics known as Sufis. The term Sufi probably came from the patched woolen garments favored by the mystics. Sufis did not deny Islamic doctrine, but they also did not find formal religious teachings to be especially meaningful. Thus, instead of concerning themselves with fine points of doctrine, Sufis worked to deepen their spiritual awareness. Most Sufis led pious and ascetic lives. Some devoted themselves to helping the poor. Many sought a mystical ascetic union with Allah, relying on rousing sermons, passionate singing, or spirited dancing to bring them to a state of high emotion. Muslim theologians sometimes mistrusted Sufis, fearing that in their lack of concern for doctrine, they would adopt erroneous beliefs. Nevertheless, after the 9th century, Sufis became increasingly popular in Muslim societies because of their piety, devotion, and eagerness to minister the needs of their fellow human beings. Excuse me. Sufi missionaries. Sufis were especially effective as missionaries because they emphasized devotion to Allah above mastery of doctrine. They sometimes encouraged individuals to revere Allah in their own ways. Even if their methods did not have the basis in the Quran, they tolerated the continued observance of pre-Islamic customs. For example, as well as the association of Allah with deities recognized and revered in other faiths because of their kindness, holiness, tolerance, and charismatic appeals. Sufis attracted numerous converts, particularly in lands such as Persia and India, where long-established religious faiths such as Zoroastrianism, Christianity, Buddhism, and Hinduism had enjoyed a mass following for centuries. Hajj, the symbol of Islamic cultural unity, was the Kaaba at Mecca, at which an early state attracted pilgrims. Oh my goodness. Let me pause. I'll go ahead and zone this in so that you can read this. I didn't even know this was in here. I'm sorry, guys. I never look ahead on the chapters. From all parts of Islamic world, indeed individuals from far-flung regions made their way to Mecca, visited the holy sites, and learned firsthand the traditions of Islam. Over the centuries, these pilgrims helped to spread Islamic beliefs and values to all parts of the Islamic world. And alongside the work of the ulama qadis and the Sufi missionaries, their efforts helped to make the Dal al-Islam not just a name but also a reality. Islam and the cultural traditions of Persia and India and Greece. As the Islamic community expanded, Muslims of Arab ancestry interacted regularly with peoples from other cultural traditions, especially those of Persia, India, and Greece. In some cases, particularly in lands ruled by the Umayyad and Abasid dynasties, large numbers of conquered peoples converted to Islam, and they brought elements of their inherited cultural traditions into Islamic society. In other cases, particularly in lands beyond the authority of Islamic rulers, Muslims became quite acquainted with the literary, artistic, philosophical, and scientific traditions of peoples who chose not to convert. Persian influences on Islam. Persian traditions quickly found a place in Islamic society. Since the culturally rich land fell under Islamic rule at an early date, after the establishment of the Abbasid Dynasty and the founding of its capital at Baghdad, Persian administrative techniques were crucial for the organization of the imperial structure through which rulers governed their vast empire. Meanwhile, Persian ideas of kingship, in which kings were wise, benevolent, but nonetheless absolute rulers, profoundly influenced Islamic political thought. Persian influence was also noticeable in literary works from the Abbasid Dynasty, whereas Arabic served as the language of religion, theology, philosophy, and law. Persian was the principal language of literature, poetry, history, and political reflection. The marvelous collection of the stories known as the Arabian Nights or the 1001 Nights, for example, presented popular tales of adventure and romance set in the Abbasid Empire and the court of the Harun al-Rashid. Indian influences on Islam. Indian mathematics, science, and medicine also captured the attention of Arab and Persian Muslims who established Islamic states in northern India. Muslims readily adopted what they called Hindi numerals, which European peoples later called Arabic numerals. Since they learned about them through Arab Muslims, Hindi numerals enabled Muslim scholars to develop an impressive tradition of advanced mathematics, concentrating on algebra, an Arabic word, as well as trigonometry and geometry. For a more practical point of view, Indian numerals vastly simplified bookkeeping for Muslim merchants. Muslims also found much to appreciate in the scientific and medical thought they encountered in India. With the aid of their powerful and flexible mathematics, Indian scholars were able to carry out precise astronomical calculations, which helped to inspire the development of Muslim astronomy. Similarly, Indian medicine appealed to Muslims because of its treatments for specific ailments and its use of antidotes for poisons. Greek influences on Muslims also admired the philosophical, scientific, and medical writings of classical Greece. They became especially interested in Plato and Aristotle, whose works they translated and interpreted in commentaries. For example, Ibn Rushd, 1126 to 1198, Qadi of Seville in the Caliphate of Cordoba, followed Aristotle in seeking to articulate a purely rational understanding of the world. Ibn Rushd's work not only helped to shape Islamic philosophy, but also found its way to the schools and universities of Western Europe, where Christian scholars knew Ibn Rushd as Averroes. During the 13th century, his work profoundly influenced the development of scholasticism, the effort of medieval European philosophers to harmonize Christianity with Aristotelian thought. However, after the 13th century, Greek philosophy fell out of favor with Muslim philosophers and theologians who turned instead to teachings from the Quran and Sufi mystics. Quite apart from philosophy, Greek mathematics, science, and medicine also appealed strongly to Muslims. Greek mathematics did not make use of Indian numerals, but it offered a solid body of powerful reasoning, particularly when dealing with calculations in algebra and geometry. Greek mathematics supported the development of astronomical and geographical scholarship, and studies of anatomy and physiology served as foundations for medical thought. Muslim scholars quickly absorbed these Greek traditions, combined them with the influence from India, and used them as points of departure for their own studies. The result was a brilliant flowering of mathematical, scientific, and medical scholarship that provided Muslim societies with powerful tools for understanding the natural world. This is the end of part 2, chapter 11. Thank you.